Good morning. It's my pleasure to be here this morning and to introduce this esteemed panel. I'm Leslie Palmer, the Chief Executive from San Antonio for the World Affairs Council. To my left, all the way to the left, it is my pleasure to introduce Senator Jeff Flake of Arizona. Senator Flake is a fifth-generation Arizonan. Prior to his election to the Senate, he served in the House of Representatives from 2001 to 2013. He sits on the Judiciary, Energy and Natural Resources Committees and the Foreign Relations Committee, where he serves as chairman of the Subcommittee on African Affairs. To my immediate left is Senator Jeff Merkley of Oregon, a native Oregonian and former World Affairs Council president of World Affairs Council of Oregon president. Sorry, they changed their name and it even confused me. He served in the Oregon House of Representatives and as Speaker of the House in 2007. He sits on the Appropriations Committee, Environment and Public Works Committee, Budget Committee, and the Foreign Relations Committee, serving as the ranking member on the Subcommittee on Multilateral International Development, Multilateral Institutions, and International Economic, Energy, and Environmental Policy. And serving as our moderator today is David Ensor, Director of George Washington University Project for Media and National Security, which brings journalists together with military and national security leaders for in-depth conversations. You know him as an award-winning broadcaster. He served as Director of Voice of America, as well as you've heard his voice on NPR and many other broadcast stations. Please welcome Senators Flake, Merkley, and David Ensor.
Good morning to all the World Affairs Councils of the United States. It's wonderful to be in front of you all, but I'm not sure this mic is working. 1, 2, 3. Hold it right to the mouth. Right to the mouth. 1, 2, 3. Still not.
A quick fix. There we go.
1, 2.
Yeah, no, that's the difference.
All right. Actually, I don't want to hold it too close. It's very loud. It's a real honor to be here today in front of you and between two such distinguished and thoughtful American leaders for a conversation about the future of American leadership. The title refers obviously to America's place in the world, and we're going to talk foreign policy. We're going to take a little tour of the world. We'll move around from place to place. In the next hour or so, probably Asia, where the president's just been, Africa, Europe. I imagine we'll bring up terms such as terrorism, trade, cybersecurity, nonproliferation. But being an old newsman, I feel strongly that one must always start with the lead. And there's no question in my mind what the lead is: Russia. Let's start there. This morning in your newspapers, there's a report from England, from Britain, that researchers have found that 150,000 Russian language Twitter accounts were used in the week or so before the Brexit vote to send English language messages for Brexit and mostly messages of hate towards immigrants. Earlier this week, the Prime Minister of Great Britain, Theresa May, told a banquet audience in London that Russia's attempting to undermine free societies and sow discord by weaponizing information. Quote, "We know what you're doing," she said, "and you will not succeed." Let me start by asking the senators, maybe with you first, Senator Flake, do you share her confidence that they will not succeed? And do you share her assessment? And what do you make of Putin's motivations? And what do you make of the US and European response thus far?
I certainly share her assessment. Anybody who has viewed the classified evidence of Russian involvement in our election, they were there. They had accounts, Facebook, Twitter. They stole information or emails. Whether that was dispositive in the election, we'll never know. But they certainly did meddle. And when you have, with Russia, with an economy about the size of Portugal, they're going to look for ways to punch above their weight. And cyber is certainly a way that they can do that, and to meddle in elections. So I think that their motivation is to continue, given what they would have to spend to continue to be the military power that they have been, as opposed to what the little they have to spend to actually have an outsized impact in the cyber world and trying to interfere. So I think it's going to continue from the Russian side. It's incumbent on all of us to recognize it for what it is and try to combat it. Whether or not they will succeed on the margins, certainly perhaps in other countries, they have had an impact. We'll never know how to fully gauge their impact here, but it's something we've got to recognize and combat to the extent that we can.
How do you think the administration is doing on this?
Well, I've been a little troubled that they haven't been able to quite admit the extent of Russian involvement. Perhaps the thought is that it doesn't give full credit to the election win. For whatever reason, they've been very slow to come around and still question the role that Russia played and is attempting to play in ours and other elections. So until you recognize that, it's really tough to move ahead with any effective policies. So I've frankly been pretty disappointed in the response so far.
Senator Merkley, what do you make of this?
Well, certainly social media has created an opportunity for great democratizing of information, but it turns out to be a strategic vulnerability. And Russia exploited it massively in our elections. Facebook alone, they're estimated to have reached well over 100 million Americans with messages, set up a system of botnets around the world that weighed in as if they were people. They had a building with 1,000 people commenting as if they were Americans in addition. So it's an incredible challenge to sort out real accounts from fake accounts. And the goal of the Russians was to get enough social media comments to get certain issues trending and therefore appear in the newsreel on Facebook. And they succeeded. And we see it now in the British election. I was just in Germany, and in Germany they went on a very vigilant effort to stop Russia from interfering. They warned Russia. They said there would be big consequences. And they're pretty happy. They feel like they got through that election with minimal interference. They were worried because Germany had been the victim of hacking, and a lot of documents had been stolen, but they were very vocal about their warnings. I think we have to at least start by looking at the model they used, but you have to have an administration that understands this is a huge attack on the foundation of our democracy, and we have to be a fierce watchdog if we're going to be able to take it on in the future.
Do you think that Facebook and Twitter and the other social media companies are doing all that they can and should be doing? Is there perhaps going to be a legislative role in,
they have been very
protecting our elections in 2018 and 20?
They have been very resistant, but you can see in the last month they're really starting to acknowledge what a significant responsibility they have. It isn't just here. For example, we may talk later about Burma and ethnic cleansing, but what preceded that was 3 years in which Facebook became the dominant mode of communication, and then it created a facility for Buddhist nationalists to proceed to share false stories of vicious stories about the Rohingya, doubling down on discrimination. And so you see this opportunity to really drive divisions in the world, and that wasn't done from outside, that was done from inside. So we also have to realize that we're vulnerable from inside, that in the partisan challenges that we have, instead of having a kind of real conversation about policy, it's very tempting for even American political parties to use this social media to put out falsehoods, to drive divisions. And so we're going to have to be on guard about that, as well as about the external side.
Yeah, I mean, our allies, our NATO allies in Europe, the Baltics, for example, have been attacked with sort of social media efforts, subversion of various kinds. How confident are you that NATO has and the United States' effort can deter further aggression in that part of the world?
Well, these individual countries certainly have to do their own part, and some of them, the smaller ones, it's going to be much easier for Russia, given their resources, even though, like I said, it's smaller resources than they once had. But when you're targeting Estonia or Latvia or Lithuania, they can have a really outsized impact. And so for those smaller countries that we provide a security umbrella through NATO, we obviously want to help them out. But the first thing is to recognize what's going on and to recognize this kind of information for what it is. And I think if we've made any progress in the last year, it's certainly, most of us at least, recognize the threat that's out there and maybe are a little more discerning as to what information we believe and what we don't. But it's going to continue, and Russia will find other ways to probe and hack and use this space to have an outsized influence.
Do you think that our NATO allies, such as the Baltics, can feel confident that President Trump, in the event of a need, would invoke Article 5 and would come to their assistance militarily?
It took us a long time to get where we should be and have been in defense of Article 5. I think we're finally in a place where those countries are more comfortable. But for a time there, they were worried and had a right to be worried. And as far as our role broadly in the world, I've been very concerned that we are the main architects of this rules-based international order following World War II, whether it's trade arrangements, security agreements, international organizations. We're the architects, and we seem to be the ones most eager to abandon some of this framework. And it's very troubling. I think the broader picture is very troubling. With regard to NATO, I think we're in a better place than we were 6 months ago.
Okay. Let's turn to Asia now. The president's just back from a 12-day trip to that part of the world. Obviously, a lot of attention was focused during the trip on the advances that North Korea has made towards its goal, apparent goal of having a nuclear weapon, which it can put on a missile, which is capable of hitting us. How do you see this, Senator Merkley? How did you think the president did on the trip, and what do you think the United States should do with this problem?
Well, the president avoided starting a war while he was in South Korea, and that made me very happy. So I was a little worried about that. I joined a group of senators to visit the region and the boundary of North Korea from the Chinese side, the South Korean side, talking to the Japanese. And I think the president has very little understanding of the region and very inconsistent national policies. You have it at one moment, you have him talking about fire and fury, evoking imagery of a nuclear assault, total annihilation, words like that. But the reality on the ground there is there's no military option. And so for the president to keep coming back to the military option reflects a profound lack of understanding of that area. And when I say there's no military option, there are hundreds of artillery on the North Korean side of the border that are hardened, that can protect, or not protect, but can launch and destroy Seoul. So they have a conventional deterrence. Whether we wish to acknowledge them as a nuclear power, they have nuclear weapons. And nuclear weapons create the possibility of a conventional war becoming a nuclear war. So they also have a form of nuclear deterrence. We have the prospect, if we work very, very carefully with the world, to create a strategy in which they freeze their nuclear weapon program, they freeze their testing, stop their testing of long-range ballistic missiles, and they engage in a further dialogue. That further dialogue might then envision further advances. But this is going to take a very intense coordinated effort. China is very important in this. There's a lot of tools that can be applied. North Korea has a tremendous number of workers abroad who send hard currency back to the government. That is a potential tool. There's a lot of smuggling across the border with China. That's another potential tool. The North Korean elite really value the ability of their children to study abroad. That's another potential tool. The access to a series of trade aspects, including oil, is a big tool, but that involves cooperation with both China and with Russia. They have frozen their program before and done so for a period of years. We should try to make that happen. That would be the immediate, most stabilizing thing we could accomplish. I am not confident the president's team is able to consistently rally the world in a coherent and focused manner to achieve that.
Senator Merkley mentioned China, and I suppose many analysts think China may be the key to this. I was watching, for my sins, a little C-SPAN the other day, and I watched former Secretary of State Baker suggesting that perhaps the U.S. should privately tell China, look, we need you to overthrow the regime. We're going to be okay with pretty much whatever you put in there as long as the nuclear weapons are dismantled verifiably. What do you think of that idea? Do you think there's any chance China would bite?
I'm not sure. China has a little different view of what constitutes success with regard to North Korea, and I think we've seen it displayed in the last couple of days. The president spoke about, in his speech yesterday, about his effort, and he thinks the progress that we've made for denuclearization of the peninsula. I can tell you, North Korea is not going there. They think that what they have is the only deterrent against an overthrow. China sees it differently. They think victory is a freeze over an extended period of time, as Jeff mentioned. And so China kind of undercut what the president said, but China is the key. We have very little leverage in terms of economic might or involvement. It's China. And with the president and the name calling and the nicknames and whatnot from North Korea, I'm not sure that it negatively affects that relationship. Do what you want, but it does matter in the region and how seriously our allies and regional partners take us when that kind of diplomacy is on display. And so I think that matters, and I would hope that we would take that more seriously, not just for North Korea, but so that our partners and regional allies take us seriously.
I don't actually know what your position is on the Iran nuclear agreement, but do you have any concern that the president's threat to revoke it might have an effect on North Korea's willingness to make a deal with us?
I do. I'm very concerned about that. I didn't vote for the agreement. I felt that we should have been presented as a treaty, and we should have included some strictures on Iran's ability to, or try to curb their malign influence in the region. But that wasn't the agreement. The agreement was just on the nuclear side, and frankly, on the nuclear side, it's being adhered to. Why in the world we would now go in and nullify an agreement that is at least keeping them from advancing toward a nuclear weapon when they have already received the benefits of sanction relief and international investment and relieve them of their obligations under the accord. So you have that side, but then also we need to be very careful, and it's not just with security arrangements like this, it's with trade agreements and other international agreements as well. If we want to engage the world and actually have security and trade agreements in the future, our partners have to be convinced that we're going to stick to them, and that if we go into an agreement, we'll be in it for the long term. And right now, I think a lot of our allies question that, as do our adversaries, and that's a big concern.
Senator Merkley, as we sit here, the UN Climate Change Conference is just finishing up in Bonn, in Germany. Given our president's announcement that he will not honor the Paris Agreement on reducing carbon emissions and other emissions, where do you see the climate change story going now? Are we going to end up with China as the world leader on renewable energy and climate issues, do you think?
So 5 senators went to Bonn to say we are on track to meet the 2020 goals here in America, and we are still in, and that the U.S. government is far larger and broader than simply our president. Now, we haven't actually pulled out because we can't do that legally until November 2020, which is the end of this administration. But it did send a big symbol for the president to say that he wanted to withdraw. And it meant that we have very little influence in that conversation in Bonn. But ironically, we are one of the few nations that's kind of on track to meet our 2020 goals. And we have a huge amount of grassroots action that is going to keep changing the energy economy in the United States. I've been very involved in the vision of 100 by 50. I put out a bill on it earlier this year, 100% clean renewable energy by 2050, planting basically a flag and saying, we as a human civilization on this planet have to meet that goal. And the U.S. has to be in the leadership of that. This has now helped spawn a 100% movement across the country. There are many Fortune 500 companies that have adopted the resolution, many colleges, many cities, many counties, many clubs, many places of worship, and they are saying, here's the resolution, we're committing to convert all our energy use to 100% clean renewable energy, and here's our action plan to put us on that path. And that's helping to keep us, despite the Clean Power Plan being undermined by the administration. We're going to be back in this conversation because it's one that absolutely requires us all to be deeply engaged. If the warning signs have gotten worse. Many of you will have noted over the last 3 years, world production of carbon dioxide has leveled off, but the rate of atmospheric pollution has accelerated despite that. Now, why is that? There's two explanations. One is that the oceans are not absorbing as much carbon dioxide, and the other is that we're getting more natural feedback mechanisms in terms of methane bubbling out of permafrost and peat moss and so forth. So we have seen the temperature go right with the carbon dioxide. This is a huge threat to our planet, and America is going to be deeply engaged in this conversation. Is China going to be the lead? Well, if you look at the acceleration of carbon dioxide per country, China is driving the upswing because they have a huge population that is going through a dramatic industrialization. They've been building a coal plant every few days, but they are now turning the corner. They are leveling off, and they are seeing what the pollution is doing in Beijing, and India is seeing what the pollution does in New Delhi. They want to come off coal. They know natural gas still causes the same impact on global warming, and they want to sell the renewables to the world. So they are investing heavily. So Ford just announced last week that they're going to move their electric car enterprise to China because China is more serious about the economic transformation. And so we are going to be hurting our own economy. This transformation is going to happen. The cost of solar and wind is now below the cost of everything except fracked gas, and it's competitive with that. This transformation, do we want to be engaged in it and leading it, both from an economic perspective as well as an environmental perspective? And the answer should be yes. But China is more pulling the economic advantage side of this at the moment because of the policies of their government than are we.
Yeah. Senator Flake, is climate change a national security issue?
It is, but one concern I have, and this is an area where we may differ, I wasn't a fan of pulling out of the Paris Agreement because we were on track to meet the goals, and you want to have input into these international agreements. I do think that we've got to ensure that we have carbon-free baseload power, and the only real carbon-free baseload power is nuclear. And I've been concerned at the stance that many who take very seriously the problems with climate change, but don't take seriously our need to have carbon-free baseload power. The intermittent power, the renewables is great. We're moving ahead and making great strides, but you still have to have baseload power.
One of the most dynamic places in the world doesn't get often discussed as much as it perhaps should be. I'm referring to the continent of Africa. Both of our panelists today, you both lived and worked there as younger men, right? You were a student exchange student in Ghana. Yes. And you were a Mormon missionary, were you not?
I was.
Were you in Zimbabwe, among other places?
I was.
What do you make of Mugabe perhaps being overthrown?
You know, in fact, today, my former missionary companion, Bruce Eliason, just happens to be here in Washington. We were together 35 years ago in Zimbabwe, you know, just a few years into independence, when there was great hope at that time that, you know, Zimbabwe would remain the breadbasket of Southern Africa. And instead, it has become the basket case. And in fact, I was reminded yesterday when there was news of this coup. I came to Washington during my college education and interviewed with the CIA. They had something called biographical intelligence. They had a unit where I would have been assigned to a country, and it would have been Zimbabwe. I had written my master's thesis on Mugabe and his effort to hold on to power in the late 80s and trying to explain his hold on to power. And in that job, I would have been assigned to try to figure out who would succeed and follow Robert Mugabe. It would have been great job security for 35 years. It would have been a pretty boring job as well. But anyway, yeah, it looks as if now they are calling it, nobody ever wants to admit a coup was taking place. They've called it a realignment. But But when there is a soldier, after they've taken over the broadcast facility, a soldier on TV reading a statement, it's a coup. And that's not a good sign. The fact that Mugabe may be on his way out is a good sign. What follows is still the question. Mnangagwa, the vice president who was sacked just a few weeks ago, looks like is going back into the country and will take over. The question is, will elections go forward and move beyond this horrible time? And I hope that happens. And this is a situation when we talk about the new media and social media, the way people are finding out what's happening in Zimbabwe, much as they have in the rest of the world with unrest, is Twitter and Facebook. You don't want to rely on government sources or whatnot, and so it's very useful in this case. But I sure hope that they're in for a better spell. I have a son serving a Mormon mission in the country of Namibia right now in southern Africa, so it's kind of full circle here. And I am concerned overall about our posture in Africa as a country, in our State Department. We're 10 months into this administration, and we still don't have an undersecretary for Africa. Many of these ambassador posts are vacant. South Sudan can't even hold a real hearing, oversight hearing, because we can't get somebody who has responsibility. There's no special envoy, there's no ambassador, no undersecretary, and we're 10 months in. And these kind of things matter. 2 years ago, I took a delegation to Zimbabwe, and we actually met with Mugabe. You request a meeting out of protocol. Sometimes you hope they don't grant it, but they did. And so, a 3-hour-long meeting late into the night. But one thing struck me there. Mugabe went on and just diatribe about every American president who had wronged him over the years, and every British prime minister, back to the Lancaster House Agreements of 1980. And finally he got to George W. Bush and was railing on him. I said, hey, wait a second. I'd had enough by then. I said, George W. Bush really saved you guys with PEPFAR, the program with retrovirals to help them with AIDS. It not only alleviated, suffering for millions of people, but it saved those economies as well in Southern Africa. And I'll never forget, Mugabe stopped, thought for a second, he said, I'll give you that. That's a pretty stark admission. But the point is, some of the soft power and diplomacy that we've engaged in over the years leads the way and lends itself to security and intelligence and other arrangements that we desperately need in Africa, throughout the continent, with Al-Shabaab in East Africa, Boko Haram in Nigeria, and in the Chad Basin. We desperately need those arrangements, and those only happen if we're engaged, and we remain engaged with these countries, and that engagement just simply isn't happening right now.
Senator, the media, that's us, or used to be me, focuses a lot on negative news about Africa. Stories about Boko Haram allied with ISIS in northern Nigeria, the problems of South Sudan, as the Senator mentioned. How should we look at Africa? What should U.S. policy to Africa be?
Well, first I just want to mention that Jeff Flake is the chairman of the Africa Subcommittee, and it's so great to have a leader of that subcommittee who has spent so much time in Africa and has such a great interest in it. I was very struck as a 16-year-old. I lived in a village in Ghana, and I was surrounded by people earning $1 a day. They couldn't possibly buy enough food for their children, so the children all worked in some form or another. They were either delivering bread door to door, or they were selling candy through the bus windows, and just daily existence was a very different world from what we have. The issues of economic development, on the one hand, supporting micro-business, supporting institutions that allow an economy to thrive, but we also have to keep doing a lot of work just to address the fundamental plights. And there are 4 famines in Africa where already this year more than 1 million people have died, and millions more will die. And we're providing some help in some places. Some places access is very difficult. South Sudan is very difficult. Yemen is extremely difficult. In fact, Senator Young from Indiana has been making access for humanitarian aid to Yemen a big issue, well, nearby to Africa. And so I believe there are partnerships and opportunities for America there, but the fundamentals are help address the horrific conditions when they occur in war and famine and disease, but also proceed to help nurture institutions that will provide a foundation for nations to thrive. When I was it was 1973 when I was living in Ghana, and Ghana was not very prosperous. It had driven out all its cocoa workers, and it was having a whole series of military coups. Meanwhile, Ivory Coast was doing really, really well. Now here we see the difference leadership can make. Ghana's doing much better, and Ivory Coast is having all kinds of problems. But I think those are the main ways that we can engage and be helpful.
You mentioned earlier the Rohingya in Burma, in Myanmar. I mean, we hear that bad things are happening, very bad things. But how much are you tracking it, and what do you think we can or should do about it?
So I hope every World Affairs Council in the country holds events on this. This is ethnic cleansing, and it has deep roots. The roots go back to the independence in 1945, when there were 135 cultural and ethnic groups recognized, but the Rohingya specifically were not. And then you had basically a military coup in 1962 that made things very difficult for them. And then as time progressed, they were denied any ability to even have citizenship. So they were treated as second class, almost subhuman in the context of this history. And that set the stage for a series of attacks over time on them. And as I mentioned, the growth of Facebook and the use of Facebook to incite anger and violence against them really came to fruition just in the last few months. You have horrific circumstances. You have well over 100 villages burned, military surrounding villages, shooting people as they run out, massive amounts of rape, children being killed on sight, and 600,000 refugees. Now, when a few weeks ago we were having this conversation, it was 500,000 refugees have flooded into to Bangladesh. America has to stand up when this type of ethnic cleansing occurs around the world. We have to stand up. We have to be vocal. We have to help lead the world in responding. And now we need to be engaged to help not only end it, but hopefully engage in an opportunity for healing and return of refugees. And by the way, we should be very complimentary of Bangladesh, which has really stretched itself to accommodate an enormous flood of refugees in a short period of time.
Senator Flake, I'd like to ask you about the Middle East. And one would normally go straight to the Israelis and the Palestinians, but I'm instead going to ask you about what the heck is going on in Saudi Arabia. What do you think? And what should our government think about it? The resignation of the Lebanese prime minister while living in Saudi Arabia. And I guess I would add, do you think Jared Kushner can make peace in the Middle East?
More power to him if he can. I do think there are some opportunities in terms in the Arab world in terms of pressure on the Palestinians to actually come to the table, and I hope that can happen. If that's a contribution that Kushner or others can make, given the president's insistence that he's changed the relationship between the U.S. and the Arab world, that's where he could show a difference. With regard to what's happening in Saudi Arabia, there's got to be hope that some of these changes that this young leader has put on will stick now, and hope that he hasn't overreached. The fact that women can now drive in Saudi Arabia, man, the fact that we're celebrating that in this day and age, it tells you how far they have to go. But it is encouraging that some of these steps are being made. And you've just got to hope that, like I said, they hold.
What do you think about some of these, the Saudi thing, for example? What do you make of that?
Well, so a couple things. The first is they've been very irresponsible in the way they've been attacking Yemen, not using weapons to attack basically civilian infrastructure. This is something I switched on. 2 years ago, I supported them receiving precision munitions, believing that they were hitting by accident civilian sites. Turns out that after they had precision munitions, they used them to target civilian sites. We need to be vocal about that. And what we have seen also, Saudi Arabia has had a social contract in which they have been funding terrorist training around the world. And that we like to speak very kind of critically of Iran and very favorably of Saudi Arabia. The picture is much more complicated than that. You have a center of the Sunni branch of Islam, and you have a center of the Shiite branch, and they've been at war forever in all kinds of ways. And if we could go in a clock 50 years into the future, we'd find there would be a series of battles between those sects. It's just there's a lot more weapons now and a lot more money that amplifies those conflicts. And I think we have to be very thoughtful and careful about how we get drawn into them.
Be thinking about what your questions are going to be, because I'm going to ask one last one, and then I'm going to start asking the folks in the room to come up with theirs. I frankly don't know how we're going to do this. Is it with microphones? Are there folks with microphones? Great, okay. Well, I would just like to, I served as a diplomat in Afghanistan. I'd just like to ask him, so this is a parochial question for me, because I went a little bit native there in some ways. There are a lot of people in town, foreign policy experts, I know, who are very much opposed to much of what President Trump is saying and doing in foreign policy. But one area that these same people generally are supportive is in his announcement of his policy towards Afghanistan, his plan to stick with it, to modestly increase the troops, to help create a real Afghan Air Force, his public criticism of the Pakistanis for their support for the Taliban and for the Haqqani network. I guess I don't even know what either of you think about this, but may I just briefly ask you both, Senator Flake first, has he got it right? Has H.R. McMaster got this one right? Well, I assume it came from him. I met him in Afghanistan, and he seemed to know what he was talking about.
What I see and what I've heard from the administration is, I think, some realization. One, we've got to be in it for the long haul. What that force, the level of involvement, is still open to question. But we're going to be there for a long time. I would prefer that we're in there in just more of a counterterrorism mode than a nation-building mode. We've seen the limits of nation-building. The central government's writ doesn't extend much beyond Kabul. Let's be real. But it's still, we're still putting our young men and women at risk. One of my brothers just returned the day before yesterday from a 6-month deployment in Afghanistan. It's about a dozen deployments for him around the world, mostly in Afghanistan. And so it's still very real. We don't see it as much with the force down to where it is, but for those who are serving, they're still in harm's way. But I do think we're going to be in it for the long haul. We can't afford to leave completely, but we've got to recognize the limits of our influence over time. To stand up a central government in Afghanistan was a fool's errand, assuming that would hold and be able to install it and leave. That was never going to happen.
Yeah. Senator, your thoughts?
The British poet Rudyard Kipling wrote a poem about the young British soldier in Afghanistan. And while I may have this exactly right, the last stanza is goes something like this. If you're shot and lying on the Afghanistan plain, roll over on your rifle and blow out your brains before the women come out and carve you to pieces. And a very stark portrayal of the local reception of this foreign power. And we are in a country with predominantly different religion than the United States, a huge number of tribal customs that are way outside our comfort zone, an enormous amount of corruption. Our presence has fed that corruption in a massive way. We inflated the economy of Afghanistan tenfold. When I was in Afghanistan about 8 years ago, the stories were about all of the beautiful houses being built in Dubai by all the friends, and they were all in the names of the children being built. They were, as long as America will keep pumping in money, they'll be happy to take it. But fundamentally, our main goal there was to take out Al-Qaeda. Even 8 years ago, there were only estimated 100 al-Qaeda in that country. The Taliban has reservations, if you will, safe areas in Pakistan. They're fighting for something that they believe in strongly, while a lot of the soldiers of the military are there because they can get a paycheck of the Afghan government. I met with a group of tribal leaders, Pashtun tribal leaders, and they had come from various areas around the country, and they were all in different ancient tribal dress, and each one of them said some version of, please get out of Afghanistan. And I said, isn't it the case, though, that you're aided by the healthcare centers and the transportation projects and the support for schools and the water projects? And they said, Senator, you don't understand. Every government position in Afghanistan is sold, and people buy those positions not to assist us, but to exploit us. And I thought that was an important insight, and so I talked to Ambassador Eikenberry, who basically said, yes, you have to understand they're not only just sold at the levels we think of, but down to the school teachers who sell grades. Our fundamental goal was to stop the planning of terrorist activities against the United States. Our very presence creates a cause, a rallying point for the Islamic fundamentalist world. I think that it's very hard for any administration to pull out. We've essentially become advisors, so we're not on the front line. We don't have the casualties we had. I was going up to the military hospital to see one person after another from Oregon who had lost legs, had holes in their head, just horrific injuries, and calling families whose children had died, whose sons had died. And we don't really have that rhythm now, and so these advisory roles don't exact the same toll, and no president wants to say it's time to realize we don't have to be everywhere in the world all the time, but we should ask ourselves if we are better served by monitoring, and when there is terrorist planning against the U.S., intervening, acting, rather than trying to be a permanent presence. It's easy to stay, it's hard to leave. We're way overextended in the world. We're spending so much on our military. We're undermining our education. We're undermining the rebuilding of the infrastructure in America, and really weakening the core of our nation. And Afghanistan represents an example of that type of situation. Easy to get in, hard to get out.
Boy, well, as someone who served in Afghanistan, I'm just going to say one thing, and please respond if either of you want to. And that is that the Afghans that I spoke to in the 2 years I was there also said, to a man pretty much, that the reason there is still a war in Afghanistan is because the Pakistani ISI supports the Taliban. And the minute that ever changes, the war will come to a close within a matter of months. Do either of you think that's true or untrue, or want to say anything about that? Because it's certainly a widely held view in Afghanistan.
Well, I will say this on that. And that is that having the safe areas in Pakistan to retreat to rebuild, to replan, is certainly a valuable asset. But there are a lot of parts of the country that are controlled by the Taliban that don't depend upon soldiers coming back in from Pakistan. The Pakistanis are very reluctant to take on that sanctuary because they're afraid that their own survival will. It's kind of a situation like Saudi Arabia. We have a social contract. We fund things outside of our nation so that the fundamentalists don't attack things inside our nation. With Pakistan, it's leave this section alone so that they don't undermine and attack our own foundation. And it's a tenuous situation, but it is, in other words, I'll just sum it up by saying it's an important feature, but if the argument is that without it, there would be no war, that is not the case.
So, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to now ask you to pose questions to our two panelists. I see a lady right in the forefront here with her hand up.
Microphones.
Can we bring a microphone to her?
Here.
Where are the microphones?
Here.
Oh, I see they're standing. Okay, so I can't see very well from here. There are people standing at microphones. Why don't we
Yes.
start on the left?
Good. Do I have? It's on? Okay. Thank you very much. And Senators, thank you very much for coming and for your insights today. I am the president of the Cleveland Council on World Affairs, a 31-year veteran of the Foreign Service, former ambassador to Moldova and to Ecuador. Many of you have heard, there's been a lot of publicity in the newspapers about the shortages in in funding for the Department of State and also reductions in staffing, freezing, and things like that. I'm not sure, though, that many people are aware of the appointment, the political appointment in this administration for the position of Director General of the Foreign Service. This is a position that has never had a political appointee in the job. The Director General is the person at the Department of State who is most responsible for the welfare, the quality, and the morale of the Foreign Service. The person who has been named for this position was in the Foreign Service briefly many years ago and has worked in Indiana ever since.
What's your question?
Actually, I'm not getting to a question. Thank you. I just wanted to raise your awareness of the importance of having a professional and an experienced person in the job of the person who is asking the people of the Foreign Service and the Civil Service to go out and serve our country abroad. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Over on the right.
Can I comment on that woman's point?
Please, yes. Hold on one
Just
second.
before you ask your question, I just want to comment on that point, because right now what's going on in the State Department is extremely troubling to many who have been in the Foreign Service. The upper ranks are disappearing. We've lost half of the senior ranks. They're being discouraged in terms of some of the benefits for education for children, just the treatment they're receiving. They're being offered bonuses to retire. We're losing an enormous amount of talent in a very short period of time. And having talked with the Secretary about this, I have the impression he doesn't see the asset, this incredible asset of foreign policy knowledge and experience, and what we lose by losing those people prematurely out of service. So it's a great concern, and I think that symbolically, the point you're making about this position is kind of reflecting that attitude towards the valuable asset we have.
Sir.
My name is L.J. Stambuk. I'm the President and CEO of the World Affairs Council of Charlotte. My question is about Yemen. We don't read much about it, but as bad as things are in Myanmar, the situation in Yemen seems to be even worse. We're letting the Saudis do things there that in normal times we would definitely stand up to. What is your opinion? What is going on there, and why don't we hear more about what's going on there? Thank you.
We heard from Senator Merkley.
Let me just take that a little broader. He mentioned the specifics there, but I've been extremely concerned about Congress's role with regard to authorizing use of military force. In an advisory role, when 4 soldiers were killed in Niger, the reaction around most of the country and in most of Congress was, we have soldiers in Niger. And the truth is, across North Africa, in Africa, there are some 4,000 in advised and equipped roles that aren't there under the 2001 authorization for use of force against Al-Qaeda and the Taliban that we've stretched to go against ISIS as well, but are in some strange other authorization that we just do through the National Defense Authorization Act every year or through an appropriations measure. Tim Kaine and I have put forward a bipartisan AUMF that's a kind of a new template, recognizing that most of our engagement around the world now is going to be with non-state actors, not a sovereign country, but it'll be ISIS or Al-Qaeda or some equivalent, Boko Haram, Al-Shabaab, and Congress needs to take its role seriously and jealously guard our prerogatives. And when we passed the last AUMF in 2001, there were fewer than 100 members of the House who were still serving were there. Only 23 senators were there to vote in 2001 on our current AUMF that governs our use of force internationally. So whether it's Yemen or elsewhere, Congress needs to get more involved. Not to say we're going to limit the president's authority as Article 2 power, but as long as we don't pass a new AUMF, it allows Congress, without any skin in the game, to gripe and complain about whatever any president does, Republican or Democrat, without consequence, because we haven't voted. And our allies and our adversaries and certainly our troops out there need to know that we speak with one voice. And if Congress had more of a role, I think broadly, then we would take more seriously responsibilities to ensure that what's happening in Yemen reflects our foreign policy goals and our values.
It's interesting that your committee just this week had a hearing about the question of whether or not there ought to be some limitation put on the president's ability to launch first-strike nuclear attacks. I mean, again, this is maybe the question really here is, what should Congress do? How much more assertive should Congress be? I thought it was interesting and probably quite useful to have that. Sorry. I was saying that there was a hearing this week on Tuesday in the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, most of these gentlemen are members, about the question of whether or not there should be some kind of limit put by Congress on the president's ability to make a nuclear first strike, for example, in the North Korean example. And it was, I thought, probably a useful thing to have the hearing. Whether you go forward with some kind of limitation is another question. I don't know whether, but let's keep going with questions. Why don't we go to the left?
Yeah. Günther Winkler, Naples, Florida Council. I listen to your senators and I hear more agreement than disagreement between the aisles. Very different when I listen to the social media or to the people outside on the street. Sometimes I think we are closer to a civil war between Democrats and Republicans. Mm-hmm. Who, in your opinion, stokes this fire? Is it still foreign influences, or is it the parties internally themselves?
Happy to jump into that one. No, I often reflect, when I first came to the Senate as an intern for Senator Hatfield in 1976, and then I dropped out of college for a year to be in DC, and I washed dishes and waited tables and volunteered for nonprofits and followed the new government of President Carter's coming into office. The Senate I saw then was bonded together by the experience of being in World War II. It was, we are for America. We might disagree on tactics, but we are indivisible. We are fighting for everyone. And we had these 3 decades of real prosperity after World War II that had workers who had been able to participate in the wealth they created. And there was a vision that this would continue into the future. And there was a at the water's edge mentality about foreign policy, of coming together as a united nation when it comes to foreign policy. It's so different now. And it's gotten much worse in the 9 years I've been in the Senate. We no longer have 3 networks that are and a single radio station providing wonderful insight. We have such a diverse set of media, and that media has grown into 2 opposing camps that are far apart. And so I was very struck years and years ago of being in Israel and flipping through the channels, and one was speaking in Arabic and one was speaking in Hebrew, and thinking, oh, what a division for a country, because one half of the country gets, or many people in the country get their news from one viewpoint and the other from another viewpoint. And thank goodness we don't have that problem in America, I thought. Now we have that problem in America. Symbolized by probably about a month and a half ago, I was clicking between the 2 channels to see what's being said on both sides, and I believe MSNBC was having a conversation about the fact that we need to get to the bottom of the Russian meddling and find out if there was collaboration. We got to prevent it from ever happening again, and nobody's above the law. That was one conversation. I switched over to Fox, and the subtitle on the screen said, "Coup against the President." And I leapt up and I turned up I thought, is this a 9/11 moment? I mean, coup in the United States? The commentary was, liberals are conducting an unconstitutional coup against the President of the United States. An unpatriotic, unconstitutional coup. Reflecting this vast difference of opinions and ways of spinning it out. And so it is an enormous challenge that we have. The remedies are not easy. We need to work to build partnerships across the aisle, but even the time that we have. The first Senate I knew, they were there 5 days a week. They lived in D.C. They had family relationships between the parties, deep friendships. Every lunch now, there's a partisan lunch. Scheduling a meeting with a colleague can take weeks. You meet briefly on the floor and say, hey, by the way, I have this idea. Jeff, would you like to consider this? And you hand them a card, and It's really the isolation on Capitol Hill, I think, is important to the majority and minority leader because it helps their tribe stay their tribe, united. But it's really harmful to the institution. We need a lot more interaction, friendships, understanding. Coldell's, it used to be primarily almost always bipartisan, now often are not, and so forth. So I'll just stop there and say we are in a difficult spot, ranging from the ability of foreign countries to intervene, for myths to be spread on the internet, to the difference in perspectives of our media camps. And we're going to be wrestling with this for a long time to come.
Let me just add to that. I mean, Jeff and I overcome this. We play a lot of late night tennis. And the situation on a personal level is not as bad as you see. But, you know, in Congress now, and I was just reminded the other day of how bad it's come. We're talking about tax reform now. First major overhaul of tax reform since 1986. And I was in California the other day speaking to George Shultz, President Reagan's former Secretary of State. He's 96 years old, still very much informed and involved. And he said, hey, tax reform is easy. In 1986, we got 97 votes in the Senate. Can you imagine? 97 votes. Back when Republicans and Democrats decided to share the meager credit, because, I mean, everybody's ox is gored with tax reform. More importantly, to share the political risk. And that's how it has been done in the past. And given some of the challenges, we're going to have to do that if we're going to move ahead. And a while ago, a few years ago, I took the extreme measure. Martin Heinrich, a Democrat from New Mexico, and I marooned ourselves on a deserted island in the Pacific for a week. Discovery Channel came along and filmed it called Rival Survival. We just had a machete between us and no food or water, and had to survive for a week. And we came back. None of our colleagues had known that we'd gone, and we went to promote the show later. Stephen Colbert ran a clip after we went on David Letterman, I think. Stephen Colbert ran a clip of us spearing fish or trying to survive, and he said, Flake and Heinrich proved once and for all Republicans and Democrats can get along if death is the only option. So, for what it's worth, we've empirically proven that, but we've got to do more of it.
I think we have time for just one more question, or we do.
Thank you, David, and it's to the student there.
There you go.
Hi, my name is Nani Deddy. I'm with the Santa Fe Council, and I'm from St. John's College. I have a couple of questions. The first...
Please speak up.
Oh, sorry. Okay.
Please speak up with one question.
Okay. My question is, what do you think is holding back Africa's development? Africa is the richest country in the world in terms of natural resources, and we are able to feed the world, but right now that is not what's happening, and there's a lot of countries on aid. So what do you think is holding back that development, and should we be rethinking the kind of aid that we're providing African countries and make sure that they're not completely dependent on aid?
Well, we've really got the expert as the chair here, but I'll just simply say it's a complex, vast continent, and so a little careful about speaking generically for the continent as a whole. I think colonialism set up some artificial boundaries that retain tribal divisions that can be very hard to work with. You have institutions, some have improved and strengthened for governance over time, and some have been broken apart by coup after coup or tension after tension. There have been some economic disasters along the way that from policies that were counterproductive. I think Zimbabwe has some of those in its record. So it's a whole host of things. There is, when you look at places like Transparency International or indexes of corruption, there's a lot. Now let me just take an example of a place that just haunts me, Equatorial Guinea. Equatorial Guinea has a per capita income of $20,000 a person. That's an incredibly affluent with an incredibly supply of oil. But most of that country lives on less than $2 a day. Vast, vast corruption. And Exxon makes their royalty payments not to the treasury of the country, but to the bank accounts of the president. And just an example of the challenge of, in some cases, international business conspiring with dictators to deprive the benefit of those resources you're talking about to the people.
I'll just add quickly, Jeff is right. we have done better in the last several years. The Millennium Challenge account, for example, and tying some of our economic assistance to reforms and anti-corruption measures, and that has helped. And there is good growth rates in many African countries. In many African countries, like Zimbabwe and whatnot, it's more challenging because of corruption and poor governance. So there are pockets of good things happening, but overall it's difficult.
Well, it's been fascinating listening to these two very distinguished senators from different parties, but with many agreements and a few disagreements. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I want to thank David Ensor for guiding a very excellent and insightful conversation.
Can I just say one thing as I
Of course
leave
you
here?
may, Senator.
And that is this. I loved coming to the annual World Affairs Council's events when I was Executive Director and then President of the Oregon Council. I'm so pleased that members of the Oregon Council are here, Derek Olson, the President. What you do in helping to create an understanding of foreign policy across the United States is so essential for an informed citizenry. So stay at it. Huge thank you, and we need it now more than ever.